honored to introduce our next guest speaker, Dr. Ravi Jayakaran. If you ask me what I think of when I think of Dr. Ravi Jayakaran, I think of the words measurable empowerment. I got onto his website to kind of check out a little bit about him, and I began to quickly realize that this was my kind of guy. He likes graphs and charts, and he likes to measure things. And if you really read about his work, you'll find that he not only defines the problem, but he comes up with tools to measure the severity of the problem. And once one can define the severity of the problem, you can then assess how empowered they are to address it. Dr. Jayakaran has well over 3 decades of experience in poverty reduction and strategic development programs. He is currently the Senior Associate for the Integral Wholistic Mission for the Lausanne Movement. Dr. Jayakaran has worked in the senior management positions in the corporate sector with international NGOs, the Asia Development Bank. He has lived and worked long-term in India, Cambodia, China, and the U.S., and provided technical support in more than 20 countries across Asia, Africa, Latin America, working on issues of participatory development, poverty reduction, the impact of regional economic integration, HIV/AIDS programs, street children support programs, human trafficking prevention, rapid needs assessments, corporate social responsibility, evaluations and capacity building, and holistic mission. Dr. Jayakaran lives in Atlanta, Georgia, with his wife, Vimla. Dr. Jayakaran and Vimla celebrates their 37th wedding anniversary in just a few days. They have 2 sons. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ravi Jayakaran.
Good evening. You've had a long day, and I'm going to be talking to you about measuring what matters. And certain things are pretty easy to measure. For example, how many people out of 600 are wearing coats? Just one. I discovered that this morning when I came in. And I came in last night, so I, in a hurry, just ironed a shirt and just ironed the first part, so I couldn't remove my coat. So I'm going to be talking about measuring what matters, and just a quick survey. How many of you have smartphones? Just raise your hands. Okay, those that have smartphones, please take them out and look at the website there, www.ravijayakaran.com, and go on to the first page on the home page and find the section that talks about measuring happiness. And I'm going to, don't start doing this, just find the location, and then I'm going to talk to you a little about that and several other things. And those of you who don't have smartphones, please lean across and look at what your neighbor is doing. All right? So I guess we should have everything in place. So next slide, please. Over last Christmas, both our sons decided to have some fun with me, and they got me a thing called the jawbone. That's what it looks like. And it's a device that tracks everything you do. So it measures the number of steps you've taken, how many flights of stairs you've climbed, how many calories you've burned, how much you slept, the intensity of your sleep and stuff. And then it sends this information, next slide please. It sends this information to your iPhone. And so you can actually track, and it gives you a graph, a daily graph, a summarized weekly graph, a monthly graph, and over the year how you have performed in each of those things. So it keeps a track of how much you walked, running. I never ran, but it keeps a track of the distance. It sees how many flights you climbed, and there you can see one particular day I climbed a lot of steps. balance it off the next day by not climbing too many, and then your sleep analysis, and so on. So, next slide, please. So how am I doing? Not too good. Because whoever determined the number of steps and how much I must walk and so on was really liberal with setting very high standards. And I don't know why they set standards like 10,000 steps. And in the first few days, my device would say, you're doing quite well, you need to speed up a little bit. And at that stage, I was doing like 2,000 steps. And the one day I did 8,000 steps, it says, you can do a little better than that. So I've got to find an IT specialist who can help me to reduce some of those standards so that I'm doing better in this whole process. Next slide, please. So, the next slide also. So, the important thing here is when you have something that you want to track, you need to be able to measure it. If you're not able to measure it, you will not know how you're doing. And here's a saying that someone came up with: you get what you inspect, not what you expect. You get what you inspect, not what you expect. So you can expect all sorts of things, but if you're not tracking it, you're not inspecting it, then you're not going to know how you're doing. So let's move to the next slide. Now, the tendency for measuring, because some of these outcomes, the impacts, are not so easy to measure. And so because they're not easy to measure, the tendency is for us to track things that are inputs or activity or at the most an output level. And that really does not show you the impact and the change that has taken place. So we're going to look at some of these things. I'm going to tell you some examples and how we would actually develop tools to measure some of these things that are important to us. So here you have the example, let's go back again, the example of the tool related to measuring happiness. So we look at a standard method, we look at standard information, authentic happiness, which is tested by psychologists through multiple trials all over the world. They've come up with 5 things that are important. That you have positive emotion. I see some of you already trying to do your exercise. Don't do it just now. So positive emotion. What is the extent? It's called the PERMA index. So positive emotion that you have in your thing, and the app will explain to you how to do that. The second is engagement, the ability to engage on issues where you actually lose track of time. You're so involved in that you've lost track of time. That's engagement. Number 3, relationships. What is the quality of the relationships that you have? Are they fulfilling, and so on? And then the 4th thing is there meaning and purpose in your life? And do you sense that meaning and purpose? And then the 5th one is accomplishments. Now, if you look at that, you suddenly say, hey, where is the spiritual in all of this? The spiritual is a continuum into each of these areas. Because in the areas of our weakness is where we seek God. And that's why you hear about, when I am weak, then am I strong, because I depend on God to be my fulfillment, my strength. Okay? So here's the example of what the result would be like. Let's go to the next slide. And now you can look at your device. Look at your device, open it up, and look at happiness index. How do you do it? Now, in the first few slides, you'll get an explanation of how it's to be done. And then you come to each of these 5 areas for measurement. And if you look at that, the background is either blue or green. It's a very pleasant blue or green. The words are embedded. You don't see them so clearly. And there's a white screen with a slight dark area over it. very bright red seeds. And on your device, you can actually move the seeds. So I don't want you to do the whole exercise. Just test it out so that you know how it feels to use it. You can drag the seeds into the area of white. Can you do that? Are you able to do that? Okay, just raise your hand if you've been able to do it. Okay, I see some hands going up. So you drag the seeds to show the extent to which that is true. So you're looking at positive emotion, and it explains to you what positive emotion is, a sense of positive emotion, and to what extent do you experience that. Now, with the whole area with assessing happiness is your happiness can spike one day and be down the next day, depending on what happened to you. So when you do your assessment, look over the last 6 months or so, and what were your emotions like, okay? So don't continue to do it. I see several of you busy trying to track it. So look up here and listen to the rest, because I'm going to tell you a whole lot of other things. I don't want you to miss out on that. So you will go through, and as you drag the seeds in, look at it as a visual. Don't try to read what's written there. And see what percentage of seeds are in the white circle, and see that's what that's the extent to which you have achieved positive emotion. The seeds outside indicate the extent to which you do not have positive emotion. All right? So if it's 70%, see if that looks right. And if you look at the visual, your right brain will be operational to make that assessment. When you feel this is about right, click next and go to the next aspect. So you will do all the 5. When you finish the 5, it'll give you your score for each of those areas and your composite score for all the 5 together. Note that information, write down the date, put it on a graph, track it every 6 months, 3 months, or 6 months, or 9 months, or 12 months, and see how you're doing. Okay? Now, how does this get balanced? You're not measuring up against some universal standard for happiness. You're tracking your own happiness to see how you have progressed in your happiness from where you started at your baseline, and progressively over a period of time, how have you gone on? Okay? Make sense to everyone? So that's the first one, measuring happiness. Next slide, please. There are several tools that can be used. And some of these tools are on the website. The PEI, the CCEI, the VCI, and the UTP is still due to come up. The FFHT is due to come up, and I'm even putting up one on the foundations of Christian marriage, which should be up in about 2 or 3 weeks. So let me walk you through each of these and tell you something about them, so that the 3 that you have, you can do it yourself, do it with your spouse, do it together, and track the different levels that you have. So the first one we just finished was Happiness Index. This morning in the workshop, we talked about empowerment. I talked to you about the Survival Strategy Empowerment Index. These are areas which are difficult to measure, so people tend not to measure empowerment. How do you measure empowerment? But there are tools that actually can be used to track things. Okay, so let's look at PEI. The Personal Empowerment Index is the same one that you use for the CCEI, which is the Corporate Community Empowerment Index. If you do it for yourself, it's a Personal Empowerment Index. Now, we did a survey, sent the survey out to a whole lot of NGOs, and we asked them to give us feedback on what they considered the important components of empowerment. And an interesting thing happened. Smaller NGOs responded. Really tiny NGOs were the first to respond. And all the big NGOs with massive funding stayed silent. So we tracked and followed up with them. And I knew several of them, so I called them up and I said, why haven't you responded to the survey that we sent to you? And he said, are you recording this? I said, no. He said, then here's off the record. We didn't talk about empowerment because we don't measure it. And I said, why not? He said, because A, it's difficult to measure. B, it's not our purpose. We are driven by funds that we have, resources that we have, and therefore we don't need to get the community too involved in whether or not it's going to empower them, which is a sad thing. Anyway, we tracked this, and through the data that we got back from different people, we identified that there are 4 important things that are necessary for the whole area of empowerment. And these are the extent to which you have control over your health or your health care. That's the first thing. The second is the extent of control that you have over the revenue that you're able to bring in as an individual or a family or as a community, depending on which group you're making the assessment for. The third area is the extent to which you have control on your expenditure. So not only the revenue that you generate, the income that you generate, but do you have control on your expenses? Or is it like a leaking tank that it just flows out before you can put things in, it's gone out? Do you have control on your expenses? And then the fourth area is, what influence do you have on your micro-political environment that is supposed to benefit you or take care of you? What influence do you have backwards to influence your micro-political environment? So interestingly enough, you have more influence if you are part of a very small community in some remote place. But you could be staying on Pennsylvania Avenue and no one might even know you exist. You could be 1610 Pennsylvania Avenue, but you might be such a small fish in such a big tank that you have no influence. So these are 4 areas of influence that you have on these 4 things. So that affects your personal empowerment index. So if you do this for yourself as an individual, it becomes a PEI. You can again track your score. You can get the scores. So when you do this, you will find your score. Or if you're doing it for a whole community, for a church, for an organization, for a village, then you call it a CCEI, Corporate Community Empowerment Index. The third example here is called the VCI, the Values Change Index. Not Value Change Index, but your Values Change Index. And it's based on Galatians 5:22 and 23, part of 23. And it talks about the fruit of the Spirit. Now, it's very interesting that when the Bible talks about the fruit of the Spirit, it lists 9 of them. And it doesn't say fruits of the Spirit, it says the fruit of the Spirit. Which means that something of each one of those need to be manifest in our life if values are progressively improving in our lives. So the VCI is something, again, you go in there and then you track it, drag the seeds, move it back, just see it as a visual, the seeds within the white circle showing the extent to which that particular fruit is manifest in your life. And then come till the final score, write it down, and you can track it over a period of time. You can do that for your church, you can do that for your family, you can do it in a community where you're working, you can do it for a larger area, depending on the group. And if you do it as a group, it takes a little longer because a lot of discussions take place. If you're doing it for yourself, it's much faster to do it. So that's the value change index. I'll just briefly tell you something about the urban transformation profile, and this should be up in a couple of months. But when you look at a community, you look at an urban area and you look for transformation. I'm just going to read out some of these things. How would you know that God is active in a community, especially in an urban area? The church is growing with unconventional new members. That's the first indicator. The second indicator, the church is engaged with cutting-edge issues in that community, in that city. Third indicator, the church leaders, their opinions are sought on issues of city-level crisis. And you see this very rarely. You see this very rarely that the church is called on. Someone reaches out to a church leader and ask them, what's your opinion about this? Why is this happening? Interestingly, we saw some of it happen in Baltimore. And you repeatedly heard about a pastor being mentioned. But that should be the order of the day when the Lord is working in our communities. Number 4 indicator, multiple movements in that community. Movements of healing, movements of reconciliation, movements of transformation, movements of actually reaching out and taking back our city. And interestingly, something like that, to that tune, happened yesterday. If you were watching the news, that after all that trouble in Baltimore with all that destruction, some of the citizens got together, took their brooms and pails, and they were out in the city and cleaning it up. What was it that motivated it? We don't know. But those are indications that something is there to push that community to take action. It was spread over, it just went viral as it went on Facebook and other social media. And people were just out in the streets. Spontaneously, a lot of people, even from Johns Hopkins, were out there to stand along to say, this is not acceptable. What has happened? We are grieved over this. So a movement like that. Number 5, a new sense of hope in the community. So these are some of the indicators that you could measure. So that'll be coming up on the UTP Measuring Urban Transformation Profile, indicators that God is active in your city. And then the FFHT, the Foundations for Human Transformation. We just saw a video from Poverty Cure. And some of these, I just, as I listened to them and talked with some of their leaders, I picked up what are some of the things that you would say are essential for seeing human transformation or human well-being. What are some of these indicators? And I listed 7 of them, and we will use this as a tracking device. The rule of law prevails in a place. If you see the rule of law prevailing in a place, that makes it conducive for human flourishing. 7 things. Rule of law, free association. People freely associate with each other. Number 3, families and communities thrive in that environment. Number 4, private property is secure. Number 5, civil societies exist and flourish. Number 6, there is free exchange. Number 7, there's a culture of trust. So here are these indicators that you need to identify and then develop a tool to show the extent to which this exists. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so how do we develop these tools? Here are some of the principles that we use to develop these tools. The first principle is to identify what has to be measured. So you need to see, what are we trying to track? What do we want to know in terms of outcome or impact? What exactly are we trying to find out? So identify that. Identify the impact issue. Then find a macro expert on the issue, one who has studied the issue in multiple contexts to understand the trends, the patterns, the components, and the profile for that particular thing. Someone who's an expert, who knows it from a macro profile, who has seen the trends, understands it very clearly. These are the things that are important. And then work with him or her and take these 4 to 6 critical non-negotiable basic components into account. Once you've identified these are the components, so try not to have them too large. So what are the absolute non-negotiable minimum things that we need to see for that particular impact to be measured? And then once you've got those, design a participatory tool that is appropriate to measure this and to get a composite score. And then finally, start using the tool to assess and track. Remember what I said? You don't get what you expect, you get what you inspect. Okay. Next slide, please. Just want to give a quick shout out. The Integral Mission and Shalom workshop for Micah, several of you are members of Micah, is going to be from 14th to 18th September 2015 in Peru. So a lot of these things on measuring what matters, the whole area of holistic mission, integrated development is going to be the focus of this conference. And with that, I just want to close with something that I read a long time ago. And I don't even remember where I read this, but I remember what I read. And this is what it said. I'm not what I want to be. I'm not what people expect me to be. I am not even what I hope to be. But thank God, I am what I am, and I'm not what I used to be. So in our tracking process, make sure you're honest with what you're tracking and track it for yourself, not as though you're looking at some gold standard, but with yourself, create a baseline and make sure that you're progressively improving and becoming more and more like the Lord. Transformation is progressive, permanent, God-intended change. And that's what He wants, and that's what He will hold us accountable for. Thank you.